clear that no army or wall was going to stop Attila's inevitable march on Rome. So, maybe it was time for some good old-fashioned high diplomacy. It was worth a shot. It's not like they had anything to lose. So a deputation of a few distinguished senators was sent north, famously led by the Bishop of Rome, Leo I. The diplomatic mission traveled north, crossed the Po River, and located the Hun camp. What happened next is the stuff of legend. Attila met with Leo, heard what he had to say, and then, amazing, wondrous miracle of miracles, decided to withdraw from Italy. This immediately became a watershed moment in the history of the Catholic Church, and a key step in the process that saw the popes emerge as dominant political figures in the post-imperial West. Now, this is not to take anything away from Leo, or to ignore the guts it must have taken to walk up to Attila unarmed and ask him to please leave Italy, but it was going to take a lot more than the request of a single priest to move Attila. So what was it? The Huns had just run roughshod over all of northern Italy. Nothing could stop them, so why were they pulling back? If it wasn't the personal diplomacy of Leo, then what was it? A few things immediately come to the surface. First of all, Leo's words were almost certainly backed with a large quantity of gold, which will get anyone interested in listening to what you have to say. Second, as had been the case with the campaign in Gaul, Attila was having trouble feeding his army. The Huns did not have the kind of supply network the Romans enjoyed, and instead lived off the land as they moved from place to place. But in 452, Italy was suffering from a famine. There was just very little food to be had. Third, the Huns were victims of their own success. Sacking city after city had left them laden with treasure, and far less mobile than they had been at the beginning of the year. In other words, they needed to go home and make a deposit. Fourth, according to reports, the new Eastern Emperor Marcian was taking advantage of Attila's absence and launching raids north of the Danube. So just as the campaign in Italy was starting to bog down, reports started coming into the Huns that their families were under attack. And that's not something that you can just ignore. Fifth, and this one was probably the decisive factor, disease had begun to sweep through the Hun camps. The old historians describe it as a divinely ordered blight to punish Attila for his transgressions. But whatever it was quickly thinning the Hun ranks. You add all this up, and you get a Hun king ready to consolidate his gains and mitigate his losses. So before winter set in, Attila withdrew back to his homeland north of the Danube River. He would never return to the west. In early 453, Attila had already decided that as soon as spring arrived, he was going to turn his attention back to the east. While the Huns had been occupied in the west, Constantinople had decided to make another play at cutting off the indemnity payments. That, coupled with Marcian's attacks during 452, equaled a guaranteed Hun invasion of the east in 453. Maybe this time they could crack those Theodosian walls. But Attila would never get the chance. Marcian was himself preparing for the inevitable confrontation with Attila, when, according to legend, he dreamed that he saw Attila's bow broken at his feet. Less than a week later, messengers arrived with the stunning news. Attila the Hun was dead. There is absolutely no reliable account of his death, but two standard versions exist. The first is offered by the contemporaneous Greek historian Priscus, who reports that Attila and then choked to death in his sleep. The other, more scandalous account is that he was actually murdered by his new bride on their wedding night. An even more scandalous account is that Attila was assassinated at the order of Marcian, who obviously wanted no part of facing Attila in the field. However he died, Attila the Hun, the so-called Scourge of God, was dead, and the Roman world slept a little easier. With the sword of Damocles no longer hanging directly over their heads, the imperial courts of East and West were able to step out into the light, survey the damage Attila had wrought, and maybe entertain the idea of planning for the future again, rather than simply trying to react to the present. But though no one could have known it, Attila's would not be the only momentous death to hit the empire in the early 450s. In just a few short years, the men and women who had led Rome for the last generation would all be gone, replaced by a new slate of leaders who, for better or for worse, would lead Rome for the next generation. Now, I already accidentally blew by the first momentous death of the early 450s, because I got a little too caught up in Attila's invasion of Gaul. But in October of 450, just a few months after arranging the fateful marriage between her daughter Honoria and boring old Senator Herculanus, the great matron of the West, Galla Placidia, died. Given how long she was a central figure in Western politics, I mean, she first rose to prominence back when she was kidnapped by Alaric during the first sack of Rome, which was what, like 40 years ago? It is kind of shocking to think that Placidia was just 58 years old when she died. Not a young woman by any means, but certainly not some ancient relic. She had been the wife of a Gothic king, and given birth to a boy who might have led the Goths and Romans into becoming a single people. She was the daughter of an emperor, the brother of an emperor, the wife of an emperor, and the mother of an emperor. Intelligent and self-confident, she herself has served as regent of the West for some 14 years. And though the ascension of her rival Aetius had curtailed some of her influence, Galla Placidia remained a towering figure until the moment of her death in late 450. A remarkable woman, to be sure. 3 years later, the next great imperial death hit, as Placidia's counterpart in the east, Aelia Pulcheria, died at the age of 55. When you get right down to it, these two women, Placidia and Pulcheria, perhaps define the first half of the 5th century better than any emperor, king, or general. Pulcheria, daughter, sister, and wife of successive emperors, had strode boldly onto the stage of world history at the tender age of 14, asserting her authority over the Eastern Empire, challenging and then besting God knows how many ministers and generals who were getting ready to have their way with the underage Theodosius II. Though we didn't get too much into it, as an utterly devout Orthodox Christian, Pulcheria was responsible for building up entire quarters of Constantinople dedicated to housing and servicing the poor. Though, her religious devotion also led her to promote far less laudatory persecutions of pagans and Jews. For 40 years, Pulcheria stood at the center of the imperial court of Constantinople, acting as a rock of continuity as the ministers and generals of the East came and went. And in her last great act, she stepped into the power vacuum that opened when her brother died in 450, keeping the East from slipping into civil war. A book detailing the parallel lives and times of Galla Placidia and Aelia Pulcheria would make for great reading, if anyone feels like knocking one out for us. The deaths of Placidia and Pulcheria were acutely felt, but the bony finger of death was just getting warmed up. As I mentioned 2 episodes back, the question of who was going to marry Valentinian III's youngest daughter was fast becoming a hot topic in the court of the West. The rising officer Majorian had been put forward, but as you'll recall, Aetius had stepped in and exiled Majorian before the young man's nomination could get off the ground. Clearly, Aetius wanted no one to stand in the way of his own son, Gaudentius, and it appears that in 453 the general got his way. Valentinian agreed to an engagement between Gaudentius and Placidia the Younger. But though the engagement put Aetius tantalizingly close to becoming patriarch of the next imperial dynasty, it also likely sowed the seeds of his own destruction. Valentinian had spent his entire life under the thumb of the powerful Aetius, and the betrothal of his daughter to the general's son very likely put a simple thought into Valentinian's head. I wonder how long it will be before Aetius kills me and declares his own son emperor. Will it be on the night of the wedding itself, or will he wait a few days? And if Valentinian didn't actually come up with this thought himself, two members of the imperial court almost certainly conspired to put it there: the imperial chamberlain Heraclius and the wealthy senator Petronius Maximus. Now, as imperial chamberlain, Heraclius needed no specific motivation. Imperial chamberlains are apparently a uniformly sneaky and conspiratorial lot. But Maximus is a different story. A longtime Aetian loyalist, he apparently turned on his patron as a part of a larger project to take revenge on Valentinian. Revenge he knew would be impossible as long as Aetius stood in his way. According to a convoluted story related by 7th century historian John of Antioch, Valentinian had won one of Maximus's family rings in a bet, and used that ring to lure Maximus to rape her. And this is not a pretty story, but it is also one that may have been invented later to give a more emotional explanation for Maximus's actions. Throughout 454, Heraclius and Maximus worked steadily to erode Valentinian's faith in Aetius, and replace that faith with intense fear and distrust. Once they had the now 34-year-old emperor on the hook, they began broaching more intense subjects. Aetius is a threat to you became, shouldn't you get rid of Aetius? Became, shouldn't someone kill Aetius? Became finally, shouldn't you kill Aetius? Now, there's no way to know whether Valentinian's fear of Aetius was legitimate. That is, whether Aetius would have actively conspired to murder the emperor and elevate his son to the throne, or whether he would have been content to just let nature take its course. But given Aetius's history of ambitious backstabbing, Valentinian's fears were, I think, at least justified. This all led up to one of the most dramatic assassinations in Roman history. In September of 454, Aetius was in Ravenna, briefing the emperor and his ministers on the state of the army's finances, when, after the general turned his back for a moment, the emperor himself pulled out a dagger and stabbed Aetius to death. Valentinian obviously felt that killing the general was necessary, and that this was the only way to get to him. But still, usually, emperors enlist underlings to assassinate their enemies, rather than the other way around. Aetius was 58 years old, and had more or less held the Western Empire together for 21 years. Shortly after the murder, Valentinian was confronted by the bishop Apollinaris, who allegedly said, "I am ignorant, sir, of your motives. I only know that you have acted like a man who cut off his right hand with his left." Which just about sums it up. Aetius may have been treacherous and ambitious, but he was a damned effective general and administrator,